Again in studio. This time about simple forms of bank you can actually make by yourself. It is very hard to build some simple structure, but also some simple form together with the process with the code. But if you forget the code, it's very important. What would you actually do with $1,000? With $1,000 development, it is not possible to do anything, but of course, you can actually purchase some gold. Of course, gold is probably much cheaper than tokens, but also very poor or very rich could do the same thing with the other number. Also depends how smart they are. But on some point, it's not important how smart you are, but you must have some picture you can actually afford to offer on the web. And in exchange of that, you actually get one token or few tokens on your Ledger wallet. To understand different forms of the characteristics together with the wall, but also with blockchains, it's very, very difficult, especially in different forms of live apps. To understand algorithm application is also very difficult, especially when you come to different forms of the decimals. But also to understand different forms of the code is important. If you are looking for complete safety, of course, you should actually invest and purchase some gold instead of investing in any forms of the ledgers. The ledgers are actually extremely difficult part of Web3 app, which is actually very, very difficult. You can find in book Crystal. Different forms of life are not very, very modern, but you should actually look back and find more about gold history and how gold was actually living together with banking. That doesn't mean you should not actually use Ledger occasionally, but also to understand different forms of interface together with the apps and blockchains. The network sometimes working very hard, but also to understand different forms of what do you want to find, especially if you have a bigger site together with server integrations like me. To understand different forms of alternate conscious system, it's also not easy, but also the organizational mind together with efficiency in the wallets. A lot of people think about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin is very important. But if you have $1,000 more or less, it's very important also to think about gold. Of course, the gold potential it's not big and it actually very stop on some moment, but it's not part of technology, and that's actually the advantage. Different forms of payment systems were made in history, but they do not represent the currency. That's why it's very important to understand but also build some self blockchains together with simple forms, but also for beauty reasons together with platforms. To understand different forms of what do you want to build is also important for different banks and accounts together with your online standards. For sure, you should actually understand the citizens of every city in this world, but if you understand local citizens, you'll see how much problems you can actually have. You can have millions of problems with currency. And if you've seen this fantastic movie, you will actually know that digital currency it's actually a mistake. Not easy to understand digital currencies, and there are different forms of scams around the web. But it's very important to understand the trusted websites, which also include SSL, simple symbol, but also Sectiga protocol. From practical point of understanding public, it's not easy to think about different forms of tokens and FATs, but also different forms of the characters together with the skins. Usually, every skin has some sort of trade online, but of course, it's very important to build different forms of the virtual reality for each person. To understand different forms of interactive platforms, it's very, very complex. But it's also possible to develop some simple forms with the value. A lot of users that are actually much more developed, they might even refuse different forms of company and they might mine their own tokens, but actually also offer them on the web. If you understand services together with the domain name, you can actually build fortune. But 90% of people looks for money, and that's their self-limit. So if they look for money, they look also for the work. The work, sometimes it's also in different forms of the structure. To understand simple forms of the info here is not easy, but also the hierarchy, together with different forms of top-level domains and the history of them. In case of confusion, you should actually look for different forms of the models, but also different forms of the simple rights together with different forms of the variants. The most important solutions on the markets are not names, but different forms of systems together with the trends. Of course, different forms of servers can be very, very complex, but when it comes to complex, also look in my book Crystal. There is over 1,000 names that are actually me, but explained why fiction is actually more effective than reality and why fiction become reality if you understand it but also respect it from some point. To understand those configurations, it's not easy and actually means part of my philanthropy, but also different forms for the main sectors. Protections are not easy when you look up and down in different forms of banking industry, but also on the web, especially if you look for different DNA traffics. But also different forms of questions appear. What is really smart when you look for the apps? So some people, like me, also think that software would be the best solution if you think about some simple solutions for the server. To understand different forms of service, it's not easy because they actually include some switch from one network to other. And of course, those that work are limited on one server. But if you are leading some company or structure, maybe also a brand, probably you will be compatible with more functions or more profile. To understand different forms of the servers, it's not easy, but also technology can be very, very complex sometimes. Of course, if you think about different forms of the ledgers and how to connect that with your website is also not easy. To understand different forms of network, it's not easy, but if you understand some code, probably you can actually build broader layers together with the protocols in this world. If world is Africa, of course the communication become more poor and extremely, extremely difficult. There are different forms of networks that actually protect your privacy in your business area. The applications layers are BGP, but also DNS, FTP, and HTTP. HTTPS and IMAP are more complex, but also NTP and POP and PTP. Those protocols are not simple, and there is also the TLS and SSL protocol. To understand all those, it's sometimes important also for applications. Of course, there are also implications that are some sort of adoptions of different forms of ledgers. To understand ledgers fully, you should actually understand also how to connect them with the apps and also how the picture can actually build a better prosperity but also charity. If you think also about the charity, and if my money is charity, for sure I should do some charity for other in type of information and not sharing money. That's very important because if people see better information quality, they can actually build a better application, especially with their decimals. To understand different forms of updates is not easy, especially if you also work with Discord or different forms of the service. If you have stocks rarely listed, probably that's more lawyer work and very, very complicated together with your production. To understand different forms of improvings, it's also not easy. But also, if you think about login forums, you are actually very difficult path. People that are building different forms of wallet ledgers are part of network, but they are also corresponding with different forms of applications and work with different forms of agents. Of course, you can also pay some agents, but you don't need to pay them a lot. You can pay very little amount, but you can actually pay different forms of agents also with the picture and the image of self. If you understand the image, you will actually understand how you can donate more picture for people, and they will actually build better applications. People that do not understand that part of variety, they don't understand simple principle of economy. And of course, in cyber safety, that might be the most important. It means that 95% of people in this world that are economists, they do not understand the economy. That might be the problem in the web. If people do not understand anything, but they want to be the part of coding community. Of course, it is very important to charge people if they don't understand the code. But me, as a creator of simple forms of ledgers, it's very important also to share some info, but also some picture of different forms of electronics, but also how ledgers are built. It's not easy to explain them because there is also coin beauty in them. To understand what we exactly want, sometimes it's not easy. And that's why this movie is also here for different forms of people that want to develop quality. Of course, sometimes the quality is also security, and different forms of approach, of course, support you to build better and better ledgers. Coding become more and more complex when you understand different forms of the working in this internet world. Of course, the world is one little city, more looks like some sort of poor Africa, but from that type of perspective, you should actually think about how to improve it. To avoid any forums about confusion about me, you should actually look for my book. Of course, there is a lot of politics characters, but also some products actually listed there. To understand different forms of robust security, of course, include my book standards. Those are actually different forms of the protocol in my life. To understand each level in life and more structured forums, of course, not everyone could purchase that. That is some sort of investment you made in my forum or in my modeling forum of different forms of the process. Even if you want to purchase my network or tokens me is building, you should actually look for my methods in my book. But together with my lawyer, we discuss the price on daily basics. To understand different forms of device is also not easy. And of course, computer programs are also very, very difficult. The Java can actually build different forms of computer programs. And if you are thinking about life, you should actually also think about different forms of the health. Of course, some hubs can help you together with the architecture, but it's also very important to understand different forms of legacy together with the computer developers. To understand simple forms of the cost of computers, very important to understand that software actually run the world. But it's very important also to know that software actually built different forms of ledgers and programs for ledgers. Of course, different forms of applications are not simple, but also HTML5 technologies are extremely complex. Progression in web is extremely old, and usually the web do not have any progression. That's why sometimes it's just better to take what is yours in the terms of tokens or bitcoins, and for other people you should actually share some information that have some value. It's not easy to build some value for people that are working because they usually look for different forms of terms how they can work. They sometimes also look for the quality of work, and of course, simple film for the apps can actually build a better quality for some people, but not for all. Of course, ego could not find a lot of useful things because the ego have very difficult speed. It probably it's too fast. Me, somewhere in the history to understand simple forms of myself, probably very unavailable in apps, but it's very important also sometimes to be invaluable in films. To build some value for people, it's important probably to make films and some background and to build better forms for the workers. Different forms of the service and indicators appears if you are going to work with ledgers. It's not easy to build different forms of ledgers or better ledgers over some time. Of course, different forms of collaborations appear, but those also disappear sometime because people are working faster and faster. To understand the fiction of the ecosystem in this world is very, very, very important. If you want to do any forms of integration, you should share something valuable, but sometimes also to protect applications, but not always. If you think about some serious investments, of course, you can actually build better and better ledgers that understand apps better, but you can also buy gold. The gold is very simple forms of the metal, and that forms of the gold is sometimes simple. Sometimes people should not invest and purchase different forms of the ledgers, but they should actually only understand gold. Gold is also important and it also have daily performance, but it don't go a lot of up. The gold is actually more stable and it's not going to improve in next 10 years. Of course, the gold was having different forms of the history and it's not simple, but it's maybe more safe. Sometimes to make some safety with yourself and agreement with yourself that safety is important is also very important. To build balance with yourself, probably you should know some ledgers and some gold, and that's very important. But if you buy gold in actual form of material, probably you should decide how much you're going to spend for actually buying gold and how much you're going to spend for ledgers. Of course, the informations can pay for that. And people that are offering in their different forms of store, different forms of ledgers should actually donate few each month to those that are developing software. That's very important protocol. Of course, gold is also very important for investment or if you're saving. But if you think about more and more developing gold, you are going to see the gold do not move anywhere and you could not develop it. The gold is only a metal and it's used also in some PC. But if you think to have gold and improve it, that would be very, very strange. In that case, you should actually have ledgers and you can actually develop different forms of circuits with myself.